Tonight, you're not just falling asleep. You're beginning a journey, a quiet, moonlit walk through ancient paths. As the night deepens, let the sounds of forgotten millstones, fading oil lamps, and slow footsteps guide you through a world long gone. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these gentle stories from the past, tap subscribe, leave a soft comment, and share this with someone who needs rest tonight. Your quiet support helps keep this sleepy journey going. Now close your eyes, slow your breathing, and come with me to a time when the wheel turned slowly, and history whispered you to sleep. Imagine opening your eyes to a gray morning in the year 468. The air feels wrong, not cold exactly, but flat, as though someone had drawn a veil across the sun. The daylight is weak, a sort of pale silver that struggles through a hazy sky. Shadows are faint, and even at midday, it feels as though evening is about to fall. In the middle of the 5th century, across much of the northern hemisphere, something strange was happening in the sky. Chroniclers from Constantinople to Ireland wrote about a dimming of the sun that lasted more than a year. Crops ripened late, and some never ripened at all. This wasn't the romantic gloom of a storm. It was a dull, persistent pall, the kind that made you squint at noon as though you were standing in the light of dawn. You would not have known it at the time, but historians now suspect a series of volcanic eruptions somewhere in the tropics. Particles high in the atmosphere scattered sunlight, cooling the earth slightly and making summers unpredictable. In our modern world, this is the stuff of climate models and satellite measurements. In the 5th century, it was just the weather. And weather could mean life or death. A slow, unsettling Shanju are a farmer in northern Gaul. For most of your life, you have known the rhythm of the seasons. Winter brings frost and hard ground. Spring is mud, planting, and lambing. Summer is a green, busy time when the barley grows tall. Autumn is the harvest. But now the seasons are out of step. Spring arrives late, and even when it does, the ground seems reluctant to warm. You sow your fields in hope, but the shoots are slow to emerge. By midsummer, the air still feels cool in the morning. Fruit trees bear less than they used to, and what does grow seems smaller, as though the sun has forgotten to ripen it. The change is subtle at first, so subtle you might think it's only your own bad luck, but then you hear the same story from the next village, and the next. Merchants complain that river crossings are low in the wrong season, or that the roads are more treacherous because rains come at strange times. You begin to notice more talk in the marketplace about food prices, quiet, worried talk. The fragile web of food in the year 468, Europe is still dotted with towns that owe their survival to the old Roman supply systems. Some places still receive grain shipments from far away, especially in Italy and the eastern Mediterranean, but most people, including you, live close to the edge of subsistence. A bad harvest doesn't just mean less variety in your diet. It can mean hunger by the end of winter. In the past, the empire's tax and storage systems could smooth over bad years. Grain was stored in large horia, official warehouses, and redistributed. By the 5th century, many of these systems have broken down in the West. Local rulers and bishops sometimes try to fill the gap, but the scale is small. There is no great surplus to fall back on. So when the sky dims, when the summer is weak, and the winter long, people notice very quickly. It is not the kind of disaster that comes in a single day. It's a slow tightening, a sense that each year is slightly harder than the one before. Daily life under a dim sun, change in light has other effects too. Clothes take longer to dry on the line. Smoke from hearth fires seems to linger in the air. You find yourself using more candles in the evening, not because the days are shorter, but because they feel shorter. In the countryside, people are tied more than ever to their small plots of land. Few can risk long journeys to sell their produce because the margin for survival is shrinking. This makes life quieter in some ways, fewer travelers passing through, fewer rumors of far off events, but it also makes it lonelier. Markets are smaller, the goods more limited, iron tools are harder to come by because metal is expensive to transport and fewer smiths can afford to work full time. Instead of buying nails, you pull them from old beams and straighten them for reuse. Your shoes are patched so often they barely resemble their original form. How people explained it without modern science, the dimming of the sun seemed mysterious, perhaps even supernatural. In Constantinople, some said it was a sign of God's displeasure. In Ireland, monks recorded the strange weather alongside mentions of comets and eclipses, as though all were part of a single pattern. In some villages, older people swore they had seen such a sky before in their youth, though no one could agree on what it had meant. You might hear travelers say that dust from far off lands had filled the sky, or that the sun was ill, just as a man might fall sick. Rumors spread easily when they could not be disproven. The church was quick to offer interpretations. Priests urged more fasting, more prayers, and more almsgiving. Whether this helped the harvest was doubtful, but it gave people something to do in the face of uncertainty. Faith became not just a spiritual guide, but a framework for understanding events that seemed beyond human control. The year 468 in the larger picture in Rome, the year is marked by political struggles. The Western Empire is a shadow of itself. The Vandals control North Africa, cutting off much of the grain supplied to Italy. In Gaul, the Visigoths are firmly established and Roman authority is weak. In Britain, the last traces of imperial administration have faded away. Against this backdrop, the dimming of the sun is just one more pressure on a fragile world. Crops fail more often, armies find it harder to provision themselves, and small communities grow more isolated. The big battles and shifting borders of history books are happening, but for most people, it is the slow erosion of daily stability that matters more. The weight of small losses. Imagine sitting at your table in the evening. The meal is smaller than it was a few years ago, a bowl of barley porridge, a bit of cheese, perhaps a few dried beans. You remember when there was more bread, when fruit was sweeter, when the wine was less sour. Each change is small on its own, but together they mark a decline you cannot ignore. You wonder if it will turn around next year. The elders say the weather always changes in cycles, but they also say things were better in the old days, and you have begun to suspect they are right. A question for the next part. As the year draws to a close, you hear whispers of famine in the highlands and strange sicknesses in the cities. Whether these are true or not, you do not know, but you do know that the sky has not cleared, and you wonder, if the sun does not return to its former strength, how many more years can this way of life endure? Section 2: Trade, Movement, and the Shifting Map. When the sun dimmed and the seasons shifted, it was not only the farmers who felt the strain. Every road, river, and port in the ancient world depended in some way on the surplus of the land. A late harvest in one valley might mean fewer carts on the road that autumn. A poor fishing season might mean less salted fish for sale in the market. One shortage rippled outward, touching people far removed from its original cause. You, as an ordinary person of 468, may never have left your home district, yet your life is bound to trade more than you realize. The grain you eat might have come from a neighboring province. The salt you use to cure meat might have been dug from distant marshes or traded from far off shores. The wool that keeps you warm may have been spun locally, but the dyes, especially the more vivid ones, have likely traveled hundreds of miles. All of this is possible only when people can move goods predictably and safely, but under a dim sun and an unsettled sky, nothing feels predictable anymore. The roads grow quiet. Irony of the first changes you would notice is the absence of certain traders. The peddler who used to arrive each spring with small luxury goods, bronze brooches, bits of glassware, packets of rare spices, might not appear this year. Perhaps the roads were too dangerous, perhaps he had nothing left to trade, or perhaps he had taken his pack to another route entirely, one where goods and food were more plentiful. The great Roman roads still exist in the mid-5th century, though many have fallen into disrepair. Weeds grow in cracks, and in some places the stones have been taken for other uses. But more than the physical state of the road, it is the security of travel that matters. The collapse of central authority in the West means that merchants must deal with local tolls, bandits, and the shifting allegiances of petty rulers. Each obstacle makes long-distance trade less appealing. A merchant might think twice before hauling wine from southern Gaul to the north if the harvest is small and the profit uncertain. Instead, he may choose to sell closer to home or not at all. For towns that depend on imports, this means stalls in the market stand empty or offer only the most basic goods. The river and the sea rivers are the lifelines of transport, but they too feel the effects of climate. Unusual rain patterns might swell a river too early in the season, making navigation dangerous, or leave it too low in summer to float heavy barges. The great grain ships that once sailed from North Africa to Rome have already been disrupted for decades by the Vandal conquest. Now even the smaller coastal routes are less reliable. Fishing fleets stay in harbor more often, fearing unpredictable storms. In port towns, you might hear grumbling that foreign traders are fewer this year. the docks are quieter, the gossip that once brought news of far-off lands tidings from the east, tales of wars, rumors of strange creatures grows thin, with fewer ships, fewer ideas travel as well. Cultural exchange slows, not because people have become less curious, but because the channels for curiosity are drying up. Migrations in the gloom while many people stay put, others begin to move. In some regions, entire communities drift toward places where the harvests are better. Highland shepherds descend earlier in the year, seeking pasture that still grows. Farmers abandon land that no longer yields enough, moving closer to market towns or into the territories of more powerful lords who can offer protection and food. Not all movement is peaceful. In an age without strong central governments, migration can look like invasion. Bands of displaced people, whether they call themselves tribes, families, or war bands, may cross into new territories, creating tension with those who already live there. In the Eastern Alps, such shifts are already common. In the north, Saxon raiders cross the sea toward Britain, where Roman authority is long gone and small kingdoms rise in its place. It is hard to know whether the dim sun directly drives these movements, but it certainly makes the margins thinner. When there is just enough food to survive a good year, a bad year forces hard choices. The politics of scarcity late Roman world is a fragile patchwork of powers in 468. In the west, the emperor Anthemius sits in Italy, but his influence is weak beyond a few provinces. The Visigoths in Gaul, the Burgundians in the Rhine Valley, and the Suebi in Hispania all hold their own territories. These rulers are constantly balancing war, diplomacy, and trade. Scarcity changes that balance. Grain shortages make it harder to feed armies, which in turn makes it harder to hold territory. Leaders may seek alliances not out of shared culture or values, but out of sheer necessity. A Visigothic king might agree to peace with a Roman general simply to free up resources for feeding his people through a bad harvest. For ordinary people, these political shifts are mostly visible through changes in taxation or the arrival of new officials. You may suddenly be told to pay your dues to a different ruler. The coinage might change, its silver content reduced to stretch the treasury further. You might hear that your lord has pledged loyalty to a distant king you have never met and then, a year later, pledged to someone else. Markets in decline walk into a market in late 468 and you would see the difference from a decade before. The stalls still hold goods, but the variety is diminished. Imported olive oil is rare and expensive. Wine from distant regions is replaced by local brews. Cloth is coarser, dyed in the simple colors that can be made from nearby plants, a handful of exotic items, a piece of glass, a bit of amber, a small bronze figurine might still appear, but they are priced far beyond the reach of common folk. Barter becomes more common. A farmer might trade a measure of barley for a pair of leather shoes, or a jar of honey for a set of iron nails. Money still circulates, but its value is unstable. Coins are clipped, shaved, or imitated in base metal. Trust becomes as important as silver content. You know which neighbors you can trade with, but a stranger's coin may be viewed with suspicion. Isolation and memorious trade slows and travel becomes riskier. Communities turn inward. Stories of the wider world become hazier, filtered through rumor and old memory. In your village, the oldest people recall the days when Roman officials came to collect taxes and keep the peace, when soldiers marched along the road in bright armor. Now those memories sound like tales from another age. Some towns begin to shrink physically, without the goods and people to sustain them. Houses fall into disrepair and are not rebuilt. The great stone forums and baths built in better times are left to crumble. Weeds sprout between the paving stones and roofs collapse under winter snow. Life continues, but in a smaller, quieter frame. The shadow over trade routes, a merchant from the east might still make his way to Gaul or Hispania, but the journey is longer, harder, and more expensive. To compensate, he raises his prices, which means fewer buyers. This, in turn, discourages other merchants. A self-reinforcing loop sets in. Fewer goods make the journey because fewer people can afford them, and fewer can afford them because fewer goods make the journey. Some routes survive because they carry necessities. Salt, for example, remains worth transporting, as do certain metals. But luxury goods suffer most, and with them goes much of the connective tissue that once bound distant provinces together. Personal strategies for survival faced with these changes: you adapt, you grow more of your own food if you have land, you Learn to repair tools rather than replace them. You make clothes from undyed wool and linen, reserving rare dyes for special occasions. You preserve food in salt or vinegar against the possibility of another poor harvest. You build relationships with neighbors because mutual aid can mean the difference between hunger and survival. This is not the dramatic collapse of a city in flames. It is a slow narrowing of options. Each year you notice that you travel a little less, hear a little less news, and see fewer goods from far away. You do not know whether this will reverse or continue, only that your world feels smaller than it once did. The question that lingers is the winter of 468 approaches, the roads are quiet, the river traffic sparse. In the marketplace, talk turns to whether next year will bring better harvests or worse. No one knows for certain. Some say the dimming will pass. Others believe it is the beginning of a long decline. You wonder if the threads that connect communities continue to fray. Will the world you know simply grow smaller, or will it unravel entirely? Section 3: Famine, Sickness, and the Slow Turning of Culture. The winter after the dim summer comes early and stays late. Frost creeps over the ground weeks before you expect it. The river freezes sooner than usual, catching fishermen unprepared. Even the hardiest winter greens, cabbage, kale, leeks, grow stunted. If you are a farmer in 468, you measure the season not by dates on a calendar, but by the emptying of your grain store and the feel of your cloak against the cold. By midwinter, the bins are low. By spring, you are counting each meal in handfuls, not in bowls. This is not a sudden disaster like a fire or flood. Famine in a world already close to subsistence is a slow tightening. First, you sell or trade what you can spare: a goat, a set of iron tools, a cloak you hope to pass down to your children. Then you start cutting meals: less bread, more watered porridge. In the worst times, you boil foraged greens or grind acorns into bitter flour. Hunger's long reach. Hunger does not kill everyone outright. It works in quieter ways, weakening bodies so that other illnesses take hold. Children catch fevers more easily, wounds heal more slowly. The cough that might have passed in a well-fed man lingers and deepens into something worse. In towns, the poor suffer first and hardest. The wealthy can still buy grain brought in from better harvested regions, though at a high price, but even for them variety diminishes, imported fruits vanish. The meat is tougher, the bread coarse, and mixed with whatever filler will stretch it further. Some try to move to areas rumored to have more food, but travel takes strength, and there is no guarantee of welcome at the other end. Villages under stress are wary of strangers. Another mouth to feed can tip the balance from hunger to starvation. The quiet spread of disease. In times of scarcity, disease spreads more easily. Malnutrition lowers immunity, and crowded shelters during the cold months create ideal conditions for sickness. The winter after the dim summer, coughs and fevers run through villages. Without knowledge of germs, people blame foul air, bad water, or moral failings. Priests urge repentance. Healers brew infusions of herbs: thyme for the chest, willow for fever, but their supplies are limited. Some remedies help a little, others are useless. The sick are often cared for at home, which means illness passes easily between family members. In small communities, one bad outbreak can claim a large share of the population. The Church's expanding role. 468. The Christian Church is one of the most stable institutions left in the West. Bishops and abbots may have more real authority than distant kings. In many towns, the church becomes the center of relief efforts: storing grain, organizing charity, tending to the sick. For ordinary people, this increases the church's importance not just spiritually but materially. The priest who preaches on Sunday might also be the man who ensures you get a share of bread in a lean year. Churches sometimes open their doors as shelter against the cold. In exchange, the church's influence deepens. People begin to measure their moral worth by acts of piety and obedience. Festivals take on more religious tone, and older pagan customs fade or blend into Christian ones. In some places, even the way time is marked changes. The calendar of saints becomes as important as the old agricultural markers. Changing patterns of settlement, repeated hard years push people toward places where survival feels more likely. Some abandoned hill forts are reoccupied, valued for their defensibility in unsettled times. Market towns with good water and defensible positions swell in population as nearby farms fail. Other places shrink or vanish altogether. A hamlet with Poor soil might lose its last inhabitants when they realize it cannot support even a small group through another bad harvest. Fields are left to grow wild, stone walls crumble, and roofs fall in. The land remembers only faint traces, a scatter of pottery, a line of stones half buried in grass. Over time, this shifting reshapes the human map, roads fall out of use, local trade routes change, what was once the center of a district might, in a generation, be forgotten. Memory and story dim sun becomes part of the local memory. Old people talk about the year without a summer or the long hunger in the same tone they use for great floods or wars. In places with written records, monasteries, some town halls, the strange years are marked intercenturies. In the year of the consulship of Anthemius, the sun gave little light and the harvest failed, but for most, the memory lives in stories told around the hearth. Some say the dimming was a sign from God, others that it was the breath of a dragon sleeping in the far north. Children grow up hearing these tales, half believing them, not realizing they describe real events their own parents endured. The slow cultural turn scarcity changes culture in small practical ways. Feast days become rarer and simpler. Craftsmen turn to repairing old items rather than making new ones. Songs and stories shift from celebrating abundance to praising endurance. People become skilled in thrift. Food preservation improves out of necessity. Smoking, salting, and fermenting are practiced more widely. Building techniques adapt to colder, damper seasons, thicker walls, smaller windows, more insulation from straw and wool. Even art changes. In some regions, decorative work grows simpler, with less use of imported pigments or metals. The beauty comes from pattern and shape rather than costly materials. The return of the sun and what remains after a few years. The dimming passes, the sun grows stronger, summers warmer, crops begin to improve. To a modern observer, this might seem like a return to normal, but in 468 and the years after, the world has already shifted. Some villages never recover, the population is smaller, the networks of trade and trust altered. People who grew up in the lean years keep their habits of caution. Even in times of plenty, they store extra grain, repair rather than replace, and remember the feel of a winter cloak worn indoors. For the Church, the crisis years are a foundation for even greater influence. Communities that relied on ecclesiastical charity are more firmly bound to it. Religious festivals are more deeply rooted in the agricultural year, blending faith with the cycle of planting and harvest. Lessons in resilience living through the dim sun teaches a quiet kind of resilience. Survival is not about heroics, but about adjusting, eating differently, working differently, thinking differently about the future. Communities that manage to endure are those with cooperation, adaptability, and a degree of luck in their land and leaders. You may not have thought of yourself as part of history. Yet, decades later, when someone asks about the hardest years you can remember, you will speak of the summer that never truly came, of the pale light at noon, of the thin harvest and the silent markets. You will remember how life narrowed, and how, somehow, it went on. A reflection the year 468 was not the end of the world. But for those who lived through it, it was a reminder of how fragile the threads of life could be and how quickly they could fray when nature itself turned strange. Looking back from centuries later, historians see it as one chapter in the long, uneven decline of the Western Roman world. But to you, in that moment, it was simply the world you had to survive in, a world dimmed, a little colder, a little hungrier, but still yours. Story 2. The Last Bread from Roma Section 1. The grain that fed an emperor. If you woke up in the year 468 in the city of Rome itself, you might think you were in the heart of the ancient world. The marble columns still stand in the forums. The great basilicas are busy with worship. The aqueducts still pour water into the public fountains. But beneath this surface, the city is a shadow of its former self. One thing has changed most of all: the bread. For centuries, Rome's grain supply came not from the farms around the city, those could never feed such a population, but from far away, carried across the sea in great shipments. At first, it came from Sicily and Sardinia, then from Egypt. But by the late Empire, North Africa was the breadbasket of the West. The rich farmland of modern-day Tunisia and eastern Algeria produced the grain that kept Rome alive. Without it, the city's size and structure could not be maintained. How the system once worked in the glory days of the Roman Empire, the annona, the grain dole, was a marvel of organization. The government bought or collected grain from the provinces, stored it in massive warehouses, the Horia, and distributed it to citizens at a subsidized rate or even for free. The system fed hundreds of thousands of people. It also kept the peace. A hungry population is a restless one, and Roman rulers knew it was cheaper to supply bread than to deal with riots. Grain from North Africa was shipped in large cargo vessels called naves honorarii. These could carry hundreds of tons of wheat at a time. The ships sailed from ports like Carthage, Hippo Regius, and Hadrumetum, following the currents across the Mediterranean to the mouth of the Tiber. From there, smaller boats brought the grain upriver to Rome, where it was milled into flour and baked into bread in state-run bakeries. The Vandals take the breadbasket in 439, nearly 30 years before our moment in 468. The Vandals, a Germanic people who had moved from Spain into North Africa, captured Carthage. With that, they gained control over the fertile lands and, more importantly, over the grain supply. At first, some trade continued. The Vandals were pragmatic. They could profit by selling grain to Rome, but they also used it as leverage. In 455, the Vandal king Genseric famously sailed to Rome and sacked the city. After that, relations were strained. By 468, the Vandals were in firm control of North Africa, and the flow of grain was unreliable at best, deliberately withheld at worst. Life without the dolby, the time you walk the streets of Rome in 468, the grain dole that once fed the masses has shrunk drastically. Many citizens no longer receive regular distributions. Those who do get smaller portions. In the bakeries, loaves are smaller and made from coarser flour, often mixed with barley or millet to stretch the wheat further. The bread is darker and denser than the pale, soft loaves of earlier centuries. Some bakers add ground beans or acorns to the mix, not poisonous if prepared correctly, but bitter. For the poor, bread was the staple, sometimes the only reliable food. Without enough of it, they turn to whatever they can afford: thin vegetable stews, forage greens, dried figs when in season. Meat is a rare luxury. Fish is more common, but even that depends on the Tiber's unpredictable catch and the price in the market. Markets under pressure in the Forum Boreum, the ancient cattle market near the river. Stalls are still set up each morning, but the goods on offer tell the story of scarcity. Traders from the countryside bring small quantities of grain, but prices are high. Imported goods are rare, and when they appear, they are snapped up by the wealthy. The city's economy suffers in subtle ways. Without cheap bread, workers demand higher wages to cover their food costs. Some craftspeople leave for smaller towns where food is easier to get. Wealthy families with country estates retreat to them for part of the year, leaving their city houses empty. The political weight of hunger in Rome. Hunger is not just a personal hardship, it is a political problem. The Emperor Anthemius, ruling from Ravenna, knows that unrest in the city can undermine his already fragile position. Local officials try to arrange grain shipments from Sicily or even the eastern provinces, but these are smaller and less regular than the old African supply. The Church also steps in, distributing food to the needy, but it cannot match the scale of the imperial dole. Bishops gain prestige as they feed the hungry, while the imperial administration appears weaker. Hunger becomes a tool of politics. In times of tension, rumors spread that a certain faction is hoarding grain or that a shipment was deliberately delayed. Grain riots are not unknown, crowds gathering at the warehouses to demand distribution, sometimes breaking in to take what they can. Daily strategies for survival for an ordinary Roman. Surviving without the steady grain supply means adaptation. You learn to stretch what you have, mixing flour with other grains, making thinner soups, eating more vegetables when available. You may plant small gardens in unused spaces behind houses, along the edges of courtyards, though in a crowded city. Land is scarce. Families band together to share resources. A household with a little extra oil might trade for bread. Another with access to fish might swap for beans. These arrangements are informal but vital. The decline in public life. Fewer grain shipments mean less work for the dock workers, the bakers, the millers. The great public bakeries, once a symbol of Roman order, operate at half capacity or less. Without the bustle of constant deliveries, parts of the riverfront feel abandoned. Public events, too, become rarer. Bread and circuses once kept the people entertained and loyal. But with less bread, the circuses lose their edge. Chariot races still run in the Circus Maximus, but the prizes are smaller, the crowds thinner. The theaters see fewer productions. Hunger leaves little energy for spectacle. The shadow of the Savonian Rome knows the Vandals control the sea lanes to Africa. In the taverns, men mutter about the need to take back Carthage, merchants dream of the profits that would follow. In 468, a massive expedition is actually planned, a combined effort of the Eastern and Western empires to defeat the Vandals and restore the grain supply. Ships are built, troops assembled, vast sums spent, but in your daily life this is only a rumor, a distant hope. You have heard of such plans before, and most have come to nothing. You have learned not to trust the promises of those far away and unanswered questioners. You walk home in the fading light, passing bakeries where the day's bread is already sold out. You cannot help but wonder, if Rome can no longer feed itself, can it still be Rome? Section 2. The slow disintegration. Iwa are still in the Rome of the year 468, and the illusion of grandeur clings like dust on old marble. At first glance, the city remains impressive. The Colosseum stands. The aqueducts still stride across the landscape, carrying water to the baths and fountains. The Forum is dotted with statues of long-dead emperors, but when you linger, you notice what the locals already know. The edges are crumbling, and the repairs are no longer as thorough as they once were. Water in the aqueducts. Rome's aqueducts were once marvels, carrying clean water from distant springs into the heart of the city. In 468, they still work mostly, but the maintenance crews have dwindled. Stone blocks are missing in places. Moss creeps in where it never used to. Water pressure is weaker. A city that once prided itself on its baths now sees certain bathhouses open only on certain days because the water flow can't keep up. A patrician household on the Palatine Hill might still have an indoor fountain trickling in its atrium, but in the Subura, the crowded working class district, people line up at public fountains, jugs in hand, chatting quietly about shortages. In some neighborhoods, the flow stops entirely for hours at a time, forcing people to walk farther to collect water. The aqueducts are a metaphor for the empire itself, still functioning, but patchworked, patched over, and vulnerable. Bread, but not as before. A grain still arrives from North Africa, but not in the quantities of centuries past. The bread dole, the free grain distribution to Roman citizens, is inconsistent. Some months the distribution is generous. Others it is delayed or reduced. The bakeries, still busy, produce loaves that are sometimes gritty with small bits of stone. A sign. The mills are poorly maintained. In a Rome of this era, bread is more than food, it is politics. When it is abundant, tempers are calm. When shortages hit, grumbling spreads quickly, and the Senate grows nervous. You might hear a baker mutter that Carthage's grain ships are late again, or that a Gothic raiding party disrupted the supply chain. The cause doesn't matter as much as the effect: hunger and the fear that tomorrow might be worse. Markets and oddities. The marketplaces of Rome still bustle, but the goods are changing. The silverware in a merchant's stall may be of crudder make than in your grandparents' time. The fine olive oil from Baetica in Spain is rarer. Instead, you see more local oil of variable quality. There are luxuries still: silk from the East, pepper from India, but they are expensive, symbols of wealth for those still able to flaunt it. Curiously, you might find military gear, shields, swords, helmets sold openly in market stalls. These are not always surplus from the army. Sometimes they are second-hand goods, pawned by soldiers who haven't been paid in months. The streets and the smelly marble-paved streets are not what they once were. Between the stones, weeds push up. The drainage systems clog more often, especially in poorer quarters. In warm weather, the smell of rot mingles with the sense of roasting meat and baking bread. Rats scurry freely. The elite avoid the smell by living in elevated quarters, away from the crowded, narrow alleys. But even the wealthy can't escape entirely. The scent of decline drifts upward with the summer heat. Security and watchmen. There is still a city watch, but it is undermanned and underpaid. In the better neighborhoods, they patrol in pairs, torches lighting their way. In the Subura, they may not appear at all unless summoned. Petty theft is common. Sometimes gangs, some made up of idle soldiers, roam after dark. People adapt. They bar their doors earlier, they keep valuables hidden, and they travel in groups when they can. A divided population. One of the quieter shifts in Rome is the growing number of foreign-born residents. Germanic mercenaries, Greek merchants, Syrians, and North Africans walk the same streets as old Roman families. The Latin spoken in the markets is increasingly mixed with other tongues. To some, this is just the way of empire, a blending of peoples. To others, it's a sign that true Rome is disappearing. In quiet courtyards, senators complain about Barbarization, even as they rely on Gothic bodyguards, the emperor's procession you might, on a special occasion, see Emperor Anthemius himself. His arrival is still ceremonial guards in armor, banners fluttering, citizens lined along the route, but the crowds are smaller than in earlier centuries. Some cheer with genuine enthusiasm, others stand in silence. The emperor is an outsider. Too many a Greek from Constantinople, appointed by the Eastern Emperor Leo I. His presence is a reminder that Western Rome is now dependent on its Eastern counterpart for legitimacy and support. The symbolism is still grand, but the substance is thin. Religious tensions be 468. Christianity is firmly established, but unity is not. The city is home to theological disputes, Nicenes versus Arians, often tied to political alliances. Churches are active centers of community life, but they also serve as meeting points for factional disputes. Pagan temples still stand, though many have been converted into churches or repurposed. A few old Romans, their hair white, recall the days of sacrifices and festivals to Jupiter, but these memories are now tinged with nostalgia rather than hope of revival. A sense of waiting above all, Rome feels like a place waiting for something though. No one quite agrees on what. Some expect renewal from the East, others fear an imminent sack, and many simply live day to day, conserving what they have and remembering better years. If you pause in the forum on a quiet afternoon, you might hear an old man telling a child about the Rome of his youth, brighter, busier, cleaner. The child listens politely, but his world is the one before him, a city that is still Rome, but not the Rome of legend. In this section, we've seen the daily realities of a capital in decline, still functioning, but more fragile than it appears. In the next part, we'll step outside Rome to see how life was changing in the countryside and provincial towns, where the empire's fate was being decided in ways less visible but equally decisive. Section 3, the slow collapse. By the late summer of 468, the embers of Rome's failed expedition to Africa were still smoldering, not in the harbors of Carthage, but in the minds of those who had planned it. The grand fleet, assembled with such pomp, now existed largely at the bottom of the Mediterranean. The cost, both in coin and in confidence, was staggering. The treasury had been bled dry, and the Western Empire's military prestige had been reduced to a whisper. The political Anthemius, the Western Emperor, found himself in a position that was almost worse than outright defeat. He was trapped in an alliance that had failed spectacularly, with enemies emboldened and allies wary. The Eastern Emperor Leo had financed much of the fleet, and his resentment toward the West was palpable. Letters exchanged between the two courts in the months after the disaster carried a tone of strained formality, each blaming the other for the failure. In Rome, senators debated quietly in their marble halls about whether it was even worth maintaining the imperial title anymore. The Vandals now commanded the seas. They raided with impunity along the Italian coasts, sometimes even within sight of the great city's walls. Villages along the Tyrrhenian Sea learned to keep their grain stores hidden and their watchtowers manned, though most of the time warning bells were of little use. For ordinary people, politics was something that happened in overheated rooms far away, but the consequences were felt daily. Markets were emptier, coins became scarcer. The grand fountains still ran in Rome, but in smaller towns the aqueducts began to crack and crumble, unrepaired for lack of funds. The Vandals knew Gazaric, the Vandal king, knew better than to attempt a full-scale invasion of Italy. Instead, he perfected the art of harassment. His fleets moved with deceptive slowness, sometimes lingering off a coast for weeks before striking suddenly. They would seize ships, burn harbors, and carry away captives not to ransom, but to resettle in Vandal territory. The most unnerving aspect for the Italians was the unpredictability. A fishing village might be spared one year and destroyed the next. Monasteries along the coast learned to bury their reliquaries and manuscripts in clay jars beneath the earth whenever rumors of Vandal sales reached them. It was during this period that several important Roman texts vanished from history, likely lost in coastal raids. To the Vandals, they were just parchment and leather. To Rome, they were pieces of its fading memory, a military tooth into matter. In the wake of the failed expedition, the Western army could not be rebuilt to its former size. Recruitment faltered, and mercenaries demanded higher pay than the treasury could provide. What remained of the Roman fleet was scattered and ineffective. Anthemius tried to organize local militias, but these were poorly trained and often more loyal to their local lords than to the emperor. A farmer pressed into militia service might fight fiercely to protect his own fields, but he would not march across Italy to defend someone else. Single quotes S.BY 469. Even the great port cities were no longer safe. Vandal raiders struck at Naples, leaving behind smoldering docks and a bitter reminder that Rome's reach no longer extended far beyond its walls. The silent consequence, while historians often focus on the battles and the politics, the quieter consequences of 468 were perhaps more devastating. Trade routes that had existed for centuries began to wither. North African grain, once the lifeblood of Rome's food supply, no longer arrived in steady quantities. Prices soared and famine began to gnaw at the poorer districts. Craftsmen who had relied on imported materials, Egyptian linen, African dyes, Eastern spices, found themselves without work. Many took to the roads, joining the growing number of displaced people who wandered from town to town seeking food or shelter. Banditry increased, further destabilizing the countryside. Religious leaders began to interpret these hardships as divine judgment. In sermons across Italy, priests called on their congregations to repent for the empire's sins. Processions wound through the streets, chanting prayers for deliverance from famine and invasion. But the Vandals did not pause for prayers. The death of Ricimer 472, just a few years after the failed expedition, the Western Empire's political balance shifted violently. Ricimer, the powerful general who had acted as kingmaker for multiple emperors, died suddenly, possibly of illness, possibly of poison. His death removed one of the few men capable of organizing military resistance, though he had often used his influence for personal power rather than imperial stability. Without Ricimer's presence, factions within the Roman court began to turn on one another more openly. Assassinations, sudden arrests, and abrupt changes of office became more common. For the average citizen, these palace intrigues were distant, but they deepened the empire's paralysis. A glimpse into ordinary life. It's easy to think of this era as nothing but turmoil, but most people in 468 still woke up to familiar routines. Farmers still tended vines and olive trees. Bakers still kneaded dough in the pre-dawn hours. Families still gathered for simple meals of bread, cheese, and wine when they could afford it. What changed was the sense of security. A coastal farmer might wake before sunrise and scan the horizon for strange sails before beginning his work. A merchant might hesitate to send a shipment overland, fearing bandits, or by sea, fearing vandals. Children grew up with the sound of warning bells and the sight of armored men marching through their towns. Though these men were often more interested in collecting taxes than defending the people, the end of the West Insight disaster of 468 did not destroy the Western Empire overnight, but it accelerated its decline beyond recovery. Each year that followed was marked by further losses, territory, resources, and the intangible belief that Rome could still defend itself. When the Western Empire finally collapsed in 476, the Vandals were still a formidable power across the sea, though their own decline would follow in the next century. Yet, in a sense, the decisive moment had already passed 8 years earlier, when the Grand Fleet had burned off the coast of Africa. For the people who had lived through it, 468 was remembered not for a single battle, but for the creeping realization that Rome's world was shrinking. The empire had been reduced from a ruler of seas to a besieged peninsula, its great name still echoing but only faintly in the minds of those who once believed it eternal. And so, when you imagine waking up in the year 468, you wouldn't see an empire collapsing in dramatic bursts of flame. You would see it slowly exhaling, losing its strength with each passing month until one day, without fanfare, it simply could not rise again. But here's the question: if the expedition to Africa had succeeded, would the West have endured for another century, or was the empire already doomed, no matter the outcome? Story 3: The Slow Collapse of Trade. When the roads went quiet. Section 1: The roads from Rome. If you were to wake in the year 468 and find yourself anywhere in what used to be the Western Roman Empire, you would notice something strange. The roads, those long straight marvels of stone and gravel that once carried merchants, soldiers, and imperial couriers, had grown eerily quiet. They still stretched across the landscape like stubborn veins of a forgotten body, but the lifeblood that once flowed through them had thinned to a trickle dot in better times. These roads had been the arteries of a thriving trade network. A merchant in southern Gaul could send olive oil north to the cold reaches of Britannia and receive in return fine wool, wine, or even tin for bronze. The journey was long but predictable, the roads well maintained, and the imperial postal system, the cursus publicus, ensured that important news and goods could travel faster than in any other civilization of the ancient world. But by 468, the network was breaking. The imperial budget was bleeding from decades of war, tribute payments to enemies, and a shrinking tax base. Road maintenance, once a point of pride for the Romans, was increasingly neglected. Weeds sprouted between paving stones, bridges were left unrepaired after floods. Sections of road simply disappeared into mud after harsh winters, and no central authority came to fix them. The causes of this decline were not sudden, they were as slow and quiet as a millstone grinding away at a farmer's grain. The political map had shifted dramatically. Germanic kingdoms now controlled much of the territory that once belonged to Rome. The Visigoths held sway over Hispania, the Burgundians occupied parts of Gaul, and the Vandals ruled North Africa. In some regions, the roads were still used, but their purpose had changed. They were no longer channels of imperial order, but lines of movement for warbands, tax collectors, and local traders operating without Rome's oversight. For a trader, in 468, life had become a careful calculation. Do you risk sending goods along the old routes, knowing that tolls, bribes, or outright theft could eat into your profits? Or do you keep your trade local, bartering within a day's walk of your home, where you can at least keep an eye on your merchandise? The goods themselves had changed. Rome's far-reaching trade networks had once brought pepper from India, silk from China, and glassware from the eastern Mediterranean into even remote corners of the empire. Now, such luxuries were rare. Pepper might still make its way into the kitchens of the very rich, but it was often stale and ruinously expensive. By the time it arrived, silk was replaced by rougher linens or wool, and glass windows, once a modest feature in urban homes, became precious objects, replaced by wooden shutters or animal hide screens. But perhaps the most striking change was in the speed of information. News that once traveled in days now took weeks or months. A major battle might occur in northern Italy, yet merchants in southern Gaul would only hear of it long after the fact, often through rumor. This delay had real consequences for survival. If you were a merchant with goods stored in a city that had just been sacked, you might not know until it was far too late to salvage anything. The loss of reliable roads and centralized trade also altered the rhythm of daily life. Markets became more seasonal, tied to the agricultural calendar rather than to the steady inflow of goods from afar. Winter markets were sparse root vegetables, salted meat, dried beans, while summer and autumn brought a glut of fresh produce, much of which could not be stored for long. Without cheap amphorae and steady supply lines, olive oil might become a once-a-month treat in some places rather than an everyday staple. The great cities felt this decline most sharply. Rome itself, still the symbolic heart of the empire, had once been fed by vast grain shipments from North Africa. In the 5th century, the Vandals had seized those territories, and the grain fleet stopped by 468. Rome was dependent on local Italian harvests and occasional imports from Sicily or Gaul. Grain shortages meant bread was dearer, and the famous free grain dole had been curtailed. In lean years, riots could break out over bread prices. Even in rural areas, the collapse of long-distance trade reshaped communities. Farmers grew more self-sufficient, producing goods for their own households or for barter with neighbors rather than for distant markets. This fostered a more insular mindset. The idea of being part of a vast, interconnected empire faded, replaced by the more immediate concerns of local politics, weather patterns, and the reputation of your nearest market town, and yet the old Roman roads remained silent witnesses to the grandeur that had been. You could still walk for miles along a perfectly straight stretch, bordered by ditches and stone markers, and imagine the bustle that once filled it. Occasionally you might pass a caravan, perhaps a mule train carrying wine barrels, or a small group of merchants guarded by hired swords. Such meetings were rare enough to be memorable. It was not only physical decay that killed the trade routes, it was trust. Under the empire, a Roman merchant could expect at least a measure of legal protection. Contracts were enforced, disputes settled by magistrates, and thieves punished. But in 468, law was often whatever the local ruler said it was. In some areas, that meant harsh justice. In others, it meant the wealthy could take what they wanted with impunity. Merchants adapted by traveling with armed escorts, paying off local lords for safe passage, or forming trading partnerships that could absorb the losses of theft. As you walk along one of these roads in 468, the silence feels heavy. You pass the ruins of a Mancio estate run in where imperial couriers once rested. Its walls are half collapsed, the tiled roof long since scavenged. Weeds choke the courtyard, and a broken milestone lies by the roadside, its inscription worn and unreadable. The message is clear. The empire that built this road is no longer here to keep it alive. Still, the road itself will endure. Roman engineering was stubborn like that. Even centuries later, medieval travelers would use these same paths, unaware of the precise year they had fallen quiet. But for those living through 468, the decline of trade was not a moment in history. It was a slow, creeping change, felt in smaller markets, thinner soups, and the hollow look in the eyes of merchants whose goods never arrived. And as the roads emptied, something else began to fill the vacuum, a new kind of local economy, one that would define Europe for centuries to come. But to see it forming, you would have to look closely, past the weeds in the road and the shuttered markets, and ask yourself, when the empire's arteries collapse, what takes their place? Section to the silent empire beneath the waves. You are still standing on the dock at Ostia, the port of Rome, but in this part of the story we are going to follow the grain after it leaves your sight. Imagine yourself aboard a creaking, slow-moving merchant ship in the mid-5th century. The smell is overpowering: damp wood, tar, the faint staleness of sacks packed months ago. The grain is loaded below deck, carefully stacked in tight rows, covered in layers of coarse cloth. It is not meant to be opened until it reaches its destination. Every handful lost to spillage is a tiny defeat for the city that depends on it. A journey without speed. The voyage from Alexandria to Rome in 468 could take weeks, sometimes months if the wind refused to cooperate. The Mediterranean is not the gentle lake that many picture. It has moods, and in late winter it can turn savage. A ship could wait for days in a calm, unmoving sea, then suddenly be tossed by storms that splintered masts. Sailors in this period were less concerned with speed than with survival. They would cling to the coastline for as long as possible, moving from port to port, avoiding the deep blue where storms hit hardest. Every captain knew that the longer you stayed at sea, the greater the chance the grain below would spoil, drawing in weevils and mold. The grain tax and the weight of obligations. Grain you are standing over is not free cargo, it is part of the annona, the grain tax. In Egypt, farmers had no choice in the matter. Their payment to the empire came in the form of wheat, collected and stored at state granaries along the Nile before being shipped north. The tax system was meticulous. There were clerks whose sole duty was to weigh and record each sack before it was sealed with clay impressions, marked with the insignia of the local governor. If a seal was broken upon arrival in Rome, questions would be asked, and someone's career or life could end in disgrace. By the time the grain left Alexandria, it was already an imperial possession, destined to be distributed in Rome's public grain dole frumentatio. For many citizens, this was the difference between survival and starvation. A shortage could spark unrest, sometimes even riots. A floating target. In 468, the Western Roman Empire was weak, and the seas were not as safe as they had been under the early Caesars. Pirates, many operating under the protection of rival kingdoms, prowled the waters. The Vandal navy, in particular, had become a menace. Their base in North Africa allowed them to strike at Roman shipping with ease. A grain ship was a slow-moving, lightly armed prize. Capturing one could mean months of food for an enemy population or a fortune on the black market. Captains hired extra guards when possible, but most relied on luck and the hope that their voyage would go unnoticed. The arrival ritual. When the ships finally reached Ostia, the arrival of grain was almost ceremonial. Dock workers, overseers, and imperial officials all gathered to witness the unloading. The grain was transferred into massive warehouses, long stone buildings with high windows to keep out pests. Inside, the air was always thick with dust, and workers wore strips of cloth over their mouths. This was not a quick process. It could take days to unload a single ship, especially if officials insisted on weighing each sack to check for theft or shrinkage. Every now and then, a shipment would arrive that was unusable, rotted through from seawater leaks, or infested with insects. These were sometimes burned to prevent disease, a grim reminder of how fragile Rome's food chain had become. The people behind the grain. A few trace the journey backward. You find entire lives woven into each sack. The Egyptian farmer who sowed the wheat months ago did so with a wooden plow, guiding oxen through the narrow strip of fertile soil along the Nile. He harvested it by hand with a sickle, tied it in two bundles, and threshed it under the hooves of animals. The labor was constant, repetitive, and unglamorous. In Rome, the recipients were often the urban poor citizens entitled to a monthly ration of grain. They would carry it home, grind it into flour, and bake flat, dense loaves in communal ovens. The bread was simple, sometimes coarse, but it kept bellies full. Tension in the Sistembi 468, there were whispers in the streets of Rome. The grain was becoming less reliable. The Vandals' control of North Africa meant that Rome's supply from those fertile provinces was cut off, forcing the empire to lean even more heavily on Egyptian shipments. But the Eastern Roman Empire controlled Egypt now, and their priorities were not always aligned with the West's. Grain that might have gone to Rome could be redirected to Constantinople if politics demanded it. The average Roman citizen did not think in terms of geopolitical alliances. They thought in terms of their next loaf of bread. A missed shipment meant hunger, two missed shipments meant unrest, and unrest in the late empire was a dangerous thing. An unsettling realization is. The sun sets over Ostia's docks. You see the grain stacked neatly in storage, guarded by soldiers. The city will eat this month, but you also notice the gaps in the warehouse rows, empty spaces where more sacks should be. You hear a dockworker mutter about a ship that never arrived, lost somewhere between Crete and Sicily. No one knows whether it was sunk in a storm, taken by pirates, or simply drifted into nothingness. The stability of an empire, you realize, rests on something as fragile as a ship's timbers and the wind in its sails. Section 3, The Fall of the Shadow Court. You are standing in the outer courtyard of the Forbidden City in the year 712 CE. The summer heat hangs heavy over the lacquered gates and yellow tiled roofs. Cicadas rasp in the trees. You've been here before in this narrative of Emperor Ruizong's court, but now the mood is different. The whispers are sharper. The scribes in their ink-stained robes bow deeper when courtiers pass, not out of respect but out of caution. Something is changing. Something is about to end. The emperor's withdrawal. Ruizong has been emperor twice, first briefly as a puppet ruler under Empress Wu Zetian, and later restored after her death. But by this point his health is failing, and his will to rule is weakening. He is a man who has spent much of his life in shadows, sometimes as a figurehead, sometimes in exile, sometimes in semi-retirement. His second reign has been cautious, almost timid, avoiding major reforms or wars. Instead, his passion has turned inward, the collection of shadows, not in the literal sense but in objects, paintings, lacquerware, scrolls, and manuscripts depicting silhouettes, silhouettes in nature, silhouettes of people. The court archivists now whisper that there are more shadow scrolls than military reports in the palace. It would be easy to dismiss this as a harmless eccentricity, but in the bureaucratic language of the Tang court, the emperor's obsessions matter. Each court artist assigned to shadow work is an artist not illuminating religious manuscripts. Each storeroom turned into a shadow gallery is a storeroom no longer available for tribute goods. The empire runs on the allocation of resources, and shadows, however beautiful, do not feed armies. The ascendancy of the crown prince. While Ruizong retreats into his personal fascinations, his son, Li Longji, better known later as Emperor Xuanzong, quietly assumes more power. The ministers bring more petitions to the crown prince's quarters than to the emperor's audience hall. Edicts are issued with both signatures, the emperor's in faded ink, the prince's in firm black strokes. Li Longji is not without his own eccentricities, but he is pragmatic. He sees the court's focus on shadow collecting as a symptom of stagnation. His private letters, never meant for public eyes, describe the Forbidden City as a great hall of lanterns burning with no oil, a place where ritual and art have replaced purpose. He does not move openly against his father, but he cultivates alliances. Generals who have been waiting for imperial attention, scholars eager to see the arts shift from silhouettes to poetry and music, and ministers tired of the quiet reign. The last shadow banquet in the summer of 712, Ruizong hosts what would be his final grand celebration, a shadow banquet. The hall is lined with enormous silk panels on which shadow paintings have been brushed. In deep black ink, they depict court dancers, warriors, market scenes, and mountains at dusk. Guests sit in near darkness, lit only by lanterns behind these panels, so that the shadows themselves become the feast for the eyes. Poets recite verses about moonlight and eclipse. Musicians play soft, low-toned instruments. The emperor himself appears in a robe dyed with rare ink blue pigment. An almost perfect shadow of black against the lantern glow. It is breathtaking, in a way breathtaking and unsettling. The banquet is more silent than joyous. Courtiers glance to one another, sensing the symbolism. This is not just a celebration, it is a farewell. Abdication weeks later, citing poor health, Ruizong abdicates in favor of Li Longji, the official. Reason, written in elegant script, is that the Son of Heaven must be strong in body and mind, and that heaven has shown signs it wishes for renewal. The reality is more subtle. Ruizong has withdrawn so far into the shadows, both literal and political, that his reign has become a ghost of governance. He does not disappear entirely. Like his earlier years, he slips into semi-retirement, taking the title of Taisheng Huang, or retired emperor. He remains in the palace, surrounded by his collection, sometimes visited by his son, sometimes by poets who still appreciate the strange art of shadows. The fate of the collection over time, the shadow collection is dispersed. Some panels are gifted to monasteries where they are hung in meditation halls. Others are stored and forgotten, their silk rotting in damp storerooms. A few survive into later centuries, where scholars study them as a curiosity of Tang aesthetics, delicate minimalist works that feel modern despite their age. The idea of shadows as a subject of art never truly dies. Centuries later, in faraway lands, paper shadow puppetry becomes a respected tradition. And in China, the poetic notion of collecting shadows becomes a metaphor for holding on to fleeting beauty, things that cannot be owned, only remembered. A quiet Inding Ruizong dies in 716 CE, largely unremarked upon by the political world. By then, Xuanzong's reign has begun in earnest, ushering in what many will later call the golden age of the Tang dynasty, though that too will have its rise and fall. In the stillness of his private chambers, among the last shadow scrolls that survived, the retired emperor had lived in a world of silhouettes. Perhaps that was his way of making sense of a life spent partly in power, partly in exile, partly in the soft twilight between. And so, as you imagine walking out of the forbidden city for the last time in his lifetime, you might think of the strange, stubborn beauty of dedicating oneself to something the world sees as useless. In the grand sweep of history, shadows may seem unimportant, but to Ruizong they were the truest reflection of what life had been: clear in outline, elusive in detail. Reflection: if you had the choice between ruling an empire and spending your life collecting something that fascinated only you, which would you choose? Would you serve the demands of the state, or would you serve the quiet pull of your own obsessions? Story 4: The Summer Without a Sun, the Year 536, Section 1. A sky gone dark. If you were alive in the year 536, you might remember the sun, not because you saw it, but because you didn't. For months, perhaps even more than a year, the sky was dim, as though a permanent twilight had settled over the world. Chroniclers from across the globe, from Byzantium to Ireland to China, wrote of a mysterious veil in the heavens. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, wrote Procopius, a historian of the Eastern Roman Empire, like the moon, during the whole year. In Ireland, the annals speak of a failure of bread from the years 536-539, as crops withered in cold and hungry fields, and in China, court records mention frost in midsummer and failing harvests, but to truly understand what it was like, you must imagine the rhythms of a pre-industrial world, one in which your life is tied in every way to the sky above and the soil beneath your feet. The year begins, as always, with the expectation of planting in spring, the gradual growth of crops in summer, and the harvest in autumn. Then, as winter comes, you hope your stores will last until the cycle begins again. Now imagine this pattern, disrupted not with a single failed harvest, but with year after year of uncertainty. The first sign something was wrong would not have been panic, it would have been puzzlement. You might notice that the days felt shorter, even though the sun still rose and set as before. The sky would have a milky, washed out hue even at noon. Sunlight would feel weaker on your skin, almost cold. Shadows would be less sharp. Some days the light might seem as if it were filtered through thin smoke. Farmers would squint at their barley shoots and wonder if something was wrong with the seed. Others might blame the weather spirits or the sin of the people, or perhaps some omen in the heavens. You would also begin to notice that spring felt colder than usual. Perhaps there would be a frost when your seedlings should be safe from ice. The buds on the trees would be slow to open, and the fruiting plants would not grow as tall as in previous years. In towns and cities, bread prices would begin to rise quietly not because there was no grain, but because the grain that came in was less abundant and of poorer quality. The wealthy might complain about the taste of their beer or wine, while the poor simply bought less bread and watered it down with broth. News, in this time, traveled slowly but steadily. If you lived in the Byzantine Empire, you might hear rumors from merchants coming from the north that in the far lands of the Franks winter seemed to stretch endlessly. If you lived in Ireland, you might hear tales from traveling monks about strange weather in the Mediterranean, and in the east, Chinese scribes recorded a summer in which the sky was obscured and snow fell in the sixth month. These reports, scattered and incomplete, would feed a growing sense of unease. The world of 536 was already fragile. The great empires Rome in the east, the kingdoms of Europe, the dynasties of China were dependent on agriculture and trade routes. A disruption in one corner could ripple outward. The cooling meant shorter growing seasons, which in turn meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant less trade, less tax revenue, and more hungry mouths. For peasants, it was a matter of survival. For rulers, it was a matter of stability. It is tempting to imagine that people in 536 immediately recognized this as a global event, but they did not. No one had the means to measure climate on a planetary scale. What they had were eyes, memories, and local records. To a villager in northern Europe, the dim sun was a strange omen, perhaps a sign of divine displeasure. To a court astrologer in China, it was a celestial anomaly to be noted and interpreted. To a Roman bureaucrat, it was a problem for tax collection and army provisioning. Still, patterns emerged. Famines became more frequent in the years that followed. In some regions, entire communities abandoned their homes, migrating in search of better land. In others, people stayed but endured years of scarcity. In Scandinavia, archaeological evidence suggests that population numbers dropped sharply during this period, likely due to starvation. Tree ring studies today show that 536 was the coldest decade in at least 1,500 years. The trees themselves grew more slowly, their rings thinner, marking the lean years like scars. We now know what caused this darkness, at least in part. Massive volcanic eruptions, likely in the tropics, blasted ash and sulfur into the stratosphere, where they spread around the globe, reflecting sunlight away from Earth. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica preserve these traces, thin layers of volcanic glass and sulfuric acid deposits, silent witnesses to a catastrophe the people of 536 could not name. But for those alive at the time, it was not a geological puzzle. It was daily life altered in ways both subtle and severe. Your mornings were dimmer, your evenings were colder, your meals were smaller, the seasons were unreliable, and the question, on everyone's mind though perhaps rarely spoken aloud, was, when will the sun return? And what if it didn't? Section 2, Hunger and the Seeds of Plague. When the strange dimness first began, people may have hoped it was a passing anomaly, a strange season that would right itself, but by the second year the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not just bad weather. Crops in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia began failing in sequence, like falling dominoes. In Ireland, the annals of Ulster record a failure of bread from 536 to 539. In the Eastern Roman Empire, wheat and barley prices climbed until the poor could barely afford a loaf. In China's Northern Wei dynasty, frost came in midsummer, killing rice fields before they could ripen. Farther north in Scandinavia, archaeological evidence suggests an even sharper collapse. Some settlements were abandoned altogether, and signs of ritual sacrifices appear in the soil, perhaps desperate offerings to coax back the sun. With each failed harvest, hunger turned from discomfort to desperation. Peasants might boil grass or grind acorns into bitter bread. Families might thin their porridge to stretch it another day. In markets, traders carried with them smaller sacks of grain and larger demands for payment. For the wealthy, famine meant inconvenience and expense. For the poor, it meant deciding which children would eat, and hunger is not just about empty stomachs, it weakens the body's defenses. Malnutrition saps the immune system, leaving entire populations vulnerable to disease. By the mid 540s, this vulnerability would open the door to something even more devastating than the cold skies. Plague, the Justinian plague, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, erupted in 541 in the eastern Roman port of Pelusium, Egypt. From there, it spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean world. In Constantinople, Procopius claimed that at its peak, 10,000 people were dying each day. Ships carried infected rats and fleas from harbor to harbor, while caravans brought it deep into the hinterlands. The famine-weakened populace was easy. Pray for the disease.to those living through it. It must have felt as if the world was unraveling. First the sun grew dim, then the earth grew cold, then the fields failed, and now the air itself seemed to carry death. Entire neighborhoods might be emptied in weeks, their houses shuttered, their gardens overgrown. In some villages there were not enough living to bury the dead. Historians now see the sequence volcanic winter, famine, pandemic as part of a chain reaction. The dimming of the sun in 536, likely caused by one or more massive tropical eruptions, set off a decade of climatic instability. The weakened harvests and famine-stressed societies became fertile ground for the spread of plague, accelerating political and economic decline. For the Eastern Roman Empire, the blow was particularly severe. Emperor Justinian's ambitions to reconquer the lost western provinces were derailed, and the empire would never again dominate the Mediterranean as it had in earlier centuries, but for an ordinary person, a farmer in Gaul, a monk in Ireland, a merchant in Alexandria, this was not history in the abstract. It was the bread in your bowl, the warmth of your home, the health of your children. It was the sense that the world had slipped out of its proper order and might never return. The sky, meanwhile, remained pale and strange. Even in years when the light seemed to strengthen, the seasons were unpredictable. Spring frosts might follow a mild winter. Summer rains might drown crops that had barely begun to grow. Each year carried the same anxious question, will there be enough to survive until next harvest? And beneath all this quiet but unrelenting was the knowledge that the sun, the great constant of human life, had shown it could falter. Section 3, the long climb back to the light. For more than a decade after the first dimming, the climate lurched between extremes: too cold, too wet, too erratic. While the skies slowly brightened after the early 540s, the damage had already been done. The rhythms of agriculture, trade, and empire had been broken, and recovering them would take generations. In some places, survival meant adaptation. Farmers experimented with hardier grains that could survive late frosts: barley instead of wheat, rye instead of millet. In the Middle East, irrigation systems were repaired and expanded to coax life from the soil. In China, court officials advised planting more drought and cold-tolerant crops, while also stockpiling grain in state granaries against the next bad season. Religions, too, absorbed the trauma. In Europe, monasteries became refuges not just for prayer, but for food and medicine. Chroniclers there interpreted the dark sun as a warning from God, a call to repentance. In Central America, where similar sky dimming may have been seen, some cultures adjusted ceremonial calendars to match altered seasons. Myths of darkened skies, fire mountains, and a world turned cold appear in oral traditions from the Andes to the Pacific Islands, hinting that the memory of 536E's shadow traveled far. Politically, some powers never fully recovered. The Eastern Roman Empire emerged weakened, its treasury drained, and armies depleted by famine and plague. In northern Europe, archaeological evidence points to a dramatic population drop, possibly clearing the way for future migrations and the rise of new kingdoms. In the Arabian Peninsula, environmental stress may have helped set the stage for the unification of tribes in the 6th and 7th centuries, and yet life continued. By the 550s, the sun's warmth began to return in earnest. Fields in Gaul once again swayed with wheat. Vines in Italy bore grapes. In China, rice paddies mirrored a bright summer sky. Survivors, those who had endured hunger, loss, and years of uncertainty, rebuilt homes, replanted orchards, re-established trade routes. Still, the memory lingered. Old men and women could tell children of the years when the sun seemed sick, when the air was always cold, when food was never certain. In the back of the mind, the fear persisted that it could happen again, that the bright, dependable sun might one day fade. Modern science would not uncover the likely cause: massive volcanic eruptions in the tropics until the 20th century, when ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica revealed layers rich with volcanic ash and sulfur, dating precisely to 536 and 540. But to the people who lived through it, explanation mattered less than endurance. They had stared into a sky that seemed to withhold its light and lived, and perhaps that was the true legacy of 536, a reminder carved into the memory of countless cultures that even in the darkest years, the seasons eventually turn and warmth finds its way back if you'd like I can now begin story. Story 5 The Great Smog of London Winter of 1952 Section 1 A city wrapped in yellow the first frost of December 1952 arrived quietly in London. By night the River Thames slid through the city like a ribbon of black glass, its edges glinting faintly beneath weak lamps. A thin breath of fog clung to the embankments, nothing unusual for a London winter. In the streets milkmen moved with muffled steps, their rattling bottles echoing softly against brick walls. Coal fires burned in almost every home, sending pale ribbons of smoke upward into the still, cold air. But on the morning of Friday, December 5th, the fog began to thicken. At first it was the kind of mist Londoners knew well, damp, clinging, turning the air into a faded watercolor. Shop signs blurred, policemen at street corners seemed to emerge only when one was nearly upon them. Yet by midday the air was changing, it grew heavier. The pale whiteness of the fog was shifting toward a jaundiced yellow, tinted by the soot of thousands of chimneys. The smell of coal smoke grew sharper, catching in the throat. Londoners, seasoned to their city's fogs, did not immediately worry. Many still spoke fondly of the pea supers of earlier decades, when visibility might be reduced to mere yards. The smugger mixture of smoke and fog was simply part of life. People went about their errands, men tipping hats to ladies they recognized only by voice, shopkeepers fumbling to light dim lamps in their windows, horse carts and motor cars moved slowly, their outlines smudged into ghostly shapes, but by evening the fog no longer drifted. It pressed downward, hugging the ground as though it wished to settle there. The air grew thick enough to taste acrid, bitter, metallic. Breathing felt different, as if the lungs had to pull through a damp cloth. Visibility shrank to just a few feet. Red double-decker buses crawled along at walking speed, their drivers peering through open windows, guided by the footfalls of a conductor walking ahead with a lantern. Inside homes, the fog seeped in under doorways and through the smallest cracks in window frames. Curtains took on the smell of smoke, even the light from lamps turned a dull orange, unable to cut through the murk. Londoners wrapped scarves not for warmth but to filter the air. Few guessed that they were witnessing the beginning of the deadliest air pollution disaster in British history. The cold weather had trapped a layer of warm air high above the city, a phenomenon known as a temperature inversion, sealing in all the smoke, soot, and sulfur dioxide from 500,000 coal stoves and from the great power stations that loomed along the Thames. Day by day, the invisible poison was building. For now, though London carried on, shoppers still hurried down Oxford Street, their figures fading into the yellow gloom. Trams clattered along their tracks, bells ringing faintly. Children played in the streets, their laughter muffled by the thick air. But the fog was not lifting, and with each hour it was quietly growing darker, denser, deadlier. Section 2 The city slows to a crawl. The second day, Saturday, December 6th, the fog was no longer something one walked through. It was something one breathed, drank, and wore. The yellow-gray air had thickened to the density of wool. Street lamps cast no more than a faint halo a yard away. Sounds carried strangely. The clip of footsteps seemed close even when the walker was half a street distant and the low groan of ships on the Thames drifted up from the water like the voice of something ancient. London was moving, but only just. Buses ran with conductors walking ahead, one hand holding a lantern, the other outstretched to feel for the curb. Drivers leaned forward so far they seemed almost ready to step down and lead their vehicles by hand. Pedestrians kept to the walls of buildings, tracing their way by touch. In places where the fog pooled deepest, people held their arms straight out like sleepwalkers to avoid walking directly into others. The theaters and cinemas stayed open for now. In the West End, patrons stumbled through the smog, guided by ushers stationed outside with torches. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke even before the curtain rose. When the plays ended, the audience stepped out into a world that seemed to have shrunk to the space of a single breath. By nightfall, the fog had worked its way everywhere. It lay inside railway stations, blurring the faces of porters. It curled down stairwells of the underground, though trains continued to run deep. Below the city, in hospital corridors, it drifted faintly along the floors, the lamps above glowing like dim embers. Nurses noted an increase in coughing patients, some wheezing, others with eyes red and streaming, but Londoners were hardy folk, and most waved away concern. Few realized the danger. The weather pattern that had locked the smoke in place showed no sign of breaking. Coal was still being burned in every hearth. Factories roared on. Power plants sent their plumes upward only for the soot to fall back again, trapped in the stagnant air. Sulfur dioxide mingled with soot particles too, form a dense, acidic soup that irritated lungs and inflamed airways. Those with weak chests, the elderly, the very young, the ill were breathing in something far worse than mere fog. By Sunday, the city began to slow in earnest. Flights from Heathrow were cancelled. Pilots refused to take off or land when the runway was invisible from the cockpit. River traffic halted. Tugboats sounded their horns and then stayed moored. The roads were treacherous. Accidents multiplied, some so near that witnesses said they heard the crash before they could even see the wreckage. In the suburbs, farmers reported losing livestock. The animals lay in the fields, overcome by the foul air. Yet still, life went on in pockets. Shops opened their doors to customers who emerged ghost-like from the gloom. Children continued to play, though now with scarves tied over their noses. At night, the fog turned almost black, a darkness so complete that even those who lived their whole lives in London claimed they had never known the like. And still, the great smog deepened. The city, its breath stolen by its own fires, was waiting unknowingly for the wind, but the wind was not coming. Section 3. The city holds its breath. Be Monday, December 8th. London was a city trapped inside its own shadow. The great smog had been with them for 4 days, for days in which the air itself had turned into something thick enough to choke on. The temperature remained bitter, but the cold was not sharp or clean. It was damp, clinging, and full of soot. Hospitals began to fill. First came the elderly, then infants, then the middle-aged with asthma, bronchitis, or weak hearts. The waiting rooms smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool coats. Nurses moved from bed to bed with bowls of steaming water for inhalation therapy, but their eyes were red, their voices hoarse. Some staff collapsed from exhaustion and the same foul air they were treating. In the streets, the city slowed almost to stillness. The fog was no longer a background to life, it was the stage, the curtain, and the scene itself. From above, if anyone could have seen it, London would have been a smothered city, the Thames a ghost river, its bridges invisible, its towers vanished into the yellow-black cloud. Buses stopped running entirely, trains above ground halted, ambulances could not reach certain districts. Drivers became lost only a few blocks from their destinations. Coffins began to pile up in undertakers' workshops. It was not that the city had stopped, rather, it was moving at the pace of someone who knows that running will only bring the air faster into their lungs. And still the coal fires burned, families huddled together in sitting rooms, drawing warmth from the same smoke that was slowly poisoning them. Chimneys coughed their soot into the stagnant air, where it mixed with exhaust from buses, smoke from factories, and the invisible chemicals from power stations. The mixture hung low over the city like a great, unmoving lid. The death toll rose quietly. The newspapers printed advice to stay indoors, but the warnings were mild, almost gentle, as if no one wanted to alarm the public too much. Behind the scenes, doctors began to keep lists. By Tuesday morning, the first mass burials were being discussed. And then, at last, on Tuesday night, the change came. A wind, faint at first, swept in from the west. It stirred the fog, thinned it, and sent it crawling away down the river. By dawn on Wednesday, the smog had lifted. The city lay exposed beneath the pale winter sky, as though waking from a dream. But it was not a dream. The final count, taken weeks later, would estimate over 4,000 dead in those 5 days, with thousands more to perish in the weeks that followed from lingering illness. The great smog had come silently, stayed stubbornly, and left scars that would last for decades. London would remember and in time change its laws to keep the air from ever again becoming so deadly. But in that winter of 1952, for a few long breathless days, the city had learned what it meant to live inside its own shadow. Story 6. The Siege of Athens, Winter of 430. Section 1. A city behind its walls in the winter of 430 BC. Athens was not the bright marble city of later memory. It was a city under siege not by storming armies at the gates, but by an enemy camped just beyond the reach of its spears. The Peloponnesian War had dragged on for a year, and the Spartans, patient as stone, had returned to Attica to burn the countryside. The Athenians had made a choice. Their general Pericles had ordered the people not to meet the Spartans in open battle on land. Instead, they retreated inside the long walls, the fortified stone corridor that connected the city to its port at Piraeus. Behind those walls, they would outlast the invaders, relying on their navy to keep the city supplied with grain and goods from overseas. It was a strategy of endurance. And endurance at first seemed possible, but Athens was not built to hold this many people. Refugees streamed in from the villages, farmers, shepherds, whole families with carts piled high with bedding, cooking pots, and frightened chickens. They crowded into the open spaces of the city, building makeshift huts from timber and cloth. The air inside the walls grew thick with smoke from hundreds of cooking fires. Water had to be rationed. Streets became narrow channels of humanity, merchants calling out prices for salted fish, children darting between carts, old men muttering about the ruined olive groves they had left behind. At night, the press of people was so dense that the city seemed to breathe in unison, a vast, restless organism of wood, cloth, and stone. Beyond the walls, the Spartans burned. Athens could hear the distant crackle of flames from its orchards, see black columns of smoke rising above the hills. Each morning, the watchmen reported the same thing. The enemy had not moved on. They lingered, waiting for the city's patience to crumble. And yet, in these early weeks, morale held. The people trusted Pericles' plan. Inside the assembly, speeches were made about the power of the Athenian fleet, the resilience of their democracy, the glory of enduring until victory. And so the city settled into its strange, crowded rhythm, waiting for the Spartans to tire and leave. But there was something else waiting too. It was invisible. It needed no ladders, no siege engines, no spears. It would not march through the gates, but seep quietly from person to person, hut to hut. The people of Athens thought they were defending themselves from one enemy. They did not yet know that another, far more merciless, was already among them. Section 2, the first favorite, began as these things often do, quietly. A few men in the port of Piraeus fell ill, dock workers unloading grain ships from Egypt. At first, their neighbors thought it was exhaustion from the heavy labor or the damp winter air. But then the fever came sudden, violent, and unshakable. The sick burned with heat, yet they begged for cold water. Their skin flushed dark, and their eyes grew red as if from smoke. Some staggered through the streets, raving, unable to find their way home. Others collapsed where they stood, their breath shallow and quick. No one had seen anything like it before. Rumors spread faster than the sickness. Some whispered that the Spartans had poisoned the wells at Piraeus. Others said it was a curse from the gods, a punishment for breaking the sacred peace. The priests were called, sacrifices made, incense burned in the temples. But the fever did not stop. Within days, the disease reached the city itself. The crowded huts and narrow lanes became traps for the healthy and the sick alike. There was nowhere to flee. The walls that kept the Spartans out now kept the sickness in. Families tried to care for their own, but soon even the strongest were too weak to rise from their mats. The symptoms were strange, terrifying: bleeding from the mouth and nose, uncontrollable coughing, ulcers across the skin. Some died within a week, others lingered in delirium for twice as long. The healers of Athens worked without rest, but none of their remedies, herbs, baths, chants made any difference. Fear changed the city's rhythm. The markets grew quiet. Friends stopped visiting friends at night instead of music or laughter. One heard the low sound of weeping or the soft, rhythmic chanting of prayers. The watchmen on the walls began to notice that fewer and fewer men were coming to take their shifts. Even Pericles himself was seen less often, his face drawn, his voice subdued. He still spoke of endurance, but it was clear to all that this new enemy could not be outweighted as easily as the Spartans. By early spring, the fever had taken hundreds. By summer, it would take thousands. Section 3, the city unravels. By midsummer, Athens was no longer the city it had been. The plague spared no one, the rich in their stone houses, the poor in their crowded huts, the foreigners, the citizens, even the slaves. Funeral pyres burned day and night beyond the city gates, their smoke drifting over the rooftops like a dark veil. The smell of ash and rot hung in every street. At first, people still tried to follow the old customs, washing the dead, dressing them in clean linen, carrying them to the graves with songs. But as the weeks turned 2 months, the sheer number of bodies made ceremony impossible. Graves were dug in haste. Some families left their dead in doorways or on the steps of temples. Fear began to loosen the bonds of law and morality. Those who had once prided themselves on Athenian discipline now took what they could when they could. Shops stood open, their owners gone or dead, and strangers simply walked in and carried away goods. The courts stopped hearing cases. Debts were forgotten, sometimes violently. For the first time, the walls of Athens seemed like a prison. The ships still brought grain from across the sea, but fewer and fewer hands were left to unload them. In the markets, prices climbed higher each day. Those who still had wealth began to hoard, while those with nothing grew desperate. Small fights broke out over loaves of bread or jars of oil. The temples, once filled with prayer, became strange places. Some Athenians clung to the gods, making offerings in hopes of mercy. Others, convinced the gods had abandoned them, broke into the sanctuaries to steal sacred wine or gold. A few, believing nothing mattered any more, drank and feasted as though each day were their last, which for many it was. Even the soldiers on the walls were not the same. Some still kept their watch, staring south toward the distant Spartan lines, but others slipped away into the city, either to care for their families or to escape their duties entirely. The enemy beyond the walls no longer seemed as dangerous as the one within, and yet in the midst of the despair there were moments rare but real when Athenians still tried to help each other. Neighbors who had lost everything still shared water. Strangers carried the weak to shade. A few healers, knowing they could not save themselves, tended the sick until their own fever began. But these moments were like small lamps in a vast darkness, and the darkness was winning.